I think that the experiment has been run, not just in relation to the sexual revolution, all sorts of things, the whole kind of progressive package. The experiment has been run. A big part of the reason that the experiment was run was not just ideological, it was material. And that's something I spent quite a lot of time arguing in the book, right? That actually, yes, second wave feminism was a radical movement, etc. But the thing that really changed relationships between men and women was the pill. And then also the washing machine and the internet and all these other material changes that we've seen to our lives. Like, technology is the real spur of history, and ideology kind of jogs along in its wake. But there's ideology there as well, right? And I think that there are the true believers of the boomer generation have been largely proved wrong just by events, because it took some time for the consequences of tearing down the old guardrails to become evident. And I think this is why we're seeing Gen Z very much reacting against that politics.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. This is a conversation with author Louise Perry. Louise was on the podcast in the fall of 2022, talking about her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. She is back to talk about her new book and what she's been doing since then. Before we get to the interview, I just want to tell you a couple of things. As you may have noticed, I haven't been posting regular pre-recorded interviews as much lately. I've been kind of trying to get myself together over these last couple of months since the wildfires here in LA. And I've been doing live streams. As you may have heard, I have launched officially a twice a week live stream on Substack. It is called the Unspeakeasy Live. It does not necessarily have to do with the Unspeakeasy online community. It is just the name of the live stream. And in fact, I'm going to start transitioning over this podcast, The Unspeakable, and calling it The Unspeakeasy. It will be the same format, same deal, not just for women, obviously, like the Unspeakeasy community. It's for everybody, but we're going to just change the name slowly, gradually. So check us out there on Substack, the live stream. It's every Tuesday and Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. I will have guests, friends. I interact with the audience. You guys can ask questions. That is open to everybody. And then if you are a paying subscriber, you will be able to watch a recording of the live stream the next day on Substack. I will also tell you that my new book, The Catastrophe Hour, I'm holding it up here for those watching on video, is now out. This is a collection of essays that I've written over the last 10 years or so. Most of them you probably have not read because they were pretty heavily paywalled. And 3 of them are brand new. So check it out if you're interested. I will be doing a book club as part of the live stream starting in June. And we'll read an essay a week and talk about it. All right. So that is that. Become a paying subscriber if you want to get all these goodies. TheUnspeakablePodcast.com. You can also just go to meghandaum.com and find everything there. I know there's a lot of links, a lot of places to go, but thanks for coming along with me. And that's it for now. Enjoy this conversation with Louise Perry. Louise Perry, welcome back to the podcast.
Hello, welcome. Thank you for having me back.
So you were here in the fall of 2022 talking about your book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. You've done a lot of things since then, and you have a new book just out called A New Guide to Sex in the 21st Century, Young Adult Adaptation. This is an unusual format for a follow-up book. What made you want to do that? You want to get kids away from reading all their romantasy and their Twilight fiction, and this is the new YA?
This is not mutually incompatible. No, it's more actually getting them away from reading bad sex education and like crazy progressive stuff about sex and relationships. So the reason I did it, this is the first time that my publisher's an academic publishing house with a trade wing. They've never done young adult fiction or nonfiction before. The reason we did it is because I got an email from a parent suggesting I do so. And I'd had loads of emails from parents saying something on the lines of, I like your book. I would like my children to imbibe this message and information, but I don't want to give them a book that's full of horror and is also, it's intended for adults, right? Like it cites, I don't know. And we realized when we were doing the rewrite that there's a lot of references that young people are just not necessarily going to get. It's not even like referring to political theorists or whatever. It's more like, who is Marilyn Monroe?
Oh, goodness.
Who is Hugh Hefner? This kind of basic stuff. So the rewrite it's about half the length. We cut out anything that was too complicated. It contains helpful extra information about cultural figures like that. And we also excise some of the really grim bits, but not all of it, because some of it's really necessary. But, we figured that 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds don't need to read some of the worst stuff about grooming gangs or the porn industry. Or
yes, exactly. The granular details of pornography, commonly seen positions in pornography. Well, this subject, it just gets more and more interesting with each passing year. I, for one, think it's fascinating to talk about the sort of unintended downstream consequences of the sexual revolution and the women's movement. And I like to do it in a way that obviously acknowledges the huge gains that were made. We don't want to roll the clock back, but there are always things that we don't anticipate. And it's basically been like a 60-year experiment since the advent of the birth control pill, right? I mean, this is uncharted territory in the history of human civilization. And you've talked about this with great nuance and great respect and care and insight. How has the conversation changed over the last couple of years since you published the first book?
So I predicted in the conclusion that we would probably be... when did I actually write this book? Let me think. Like coming up to 4 years ago was when I actually finished writing it.
The first book, the case against the sexual revolution. Yeah.
Yeah. And I predicted in the conclusion that there would be an increasing backlash against sex-positive feminism, and that we would likely see more, say, young women reacting against it on social media and stuff like that, which is exactly what we have seen happen. Things like Evie magazine, the tradwife thing was kind of already there 4 years ago, but this has become a much stronger theme. And last week I spoke at an event in the States with Brett Cooper, who I am extremely old, right at the age of 33, so I'm not the target audience for Brett Cooper's content.
I don't even know who he is, who that is. Oh, it's a woman. There you go.
Well, no, I know, right? She is massive. She's lovely as well, by the way. I think she's 23 or maybe 24, and she's a massive star on YouTube. And she's a Catholic convert. She's recently married. She's intending to have kids. She was at the Daily Wire for a period and now left the Daily Wire. But her message is, political commentary is all about how progressivism has failed young women and how we need to be recapturing traditional values and stuff. She is so mainstream. She is so successful. I walked around the campus of the University of Virginia with her and saw her being mobbed by young people, particularly young women. So Brett, I was like, thank you for vindicating me, Brett. This is exactly what I said was going to happen. And lo and behold, it is happening, including in some ugly forms. I didn't necessarily predict this as inevitably, I think backlashes against anything tend to be blunt and sometimes really ugly, which is indeed what we've seen. We've obviously seen the wider vibe shift, of which this is just one component. But as you say, this is one great big experiment, and I don't think it's very surprising that the consequences have been mixed and have generated anger and disappointment in a lot of people.
Well, you write, the sexual revolution didn't free all of us. It freed some of us. So say more of what you mean by that.
Yeah, so who are the winners of the sexual revolution? I think, I've often wondered, why is it that the rainbow flag is the symbol of progressivism as such? Obviously, there's now the Progress Pride flag, which is a variation on the theme, but the rainbow flag has come to be the really defining symbol. And I've reached the conclusion, it's not just that it's a cool image, although it is. it's also because it was originally the gay liberation flag. And actually, of all of the movements that can be said to have been a real success for the people who push for them, gay rights is probably the top one. And actually, the other things that are kind of bundled into the progressive basket, so feminism and BLM, like race stuff in general, they'd be more disappointing, right? I think, there's so much evidence that I'm sure you've seen that women are now actually reporting that they're less happy than they were 60 years ago, that their grandmothers were. We know that race relations across the West are still deeply painful subjects. A lot of people feel as if the whole era, the whole civil rights era has actually been very disappointing in a lot of ways. I wonder if the reason that the progressive movement has kind of lasered it on the rainbow flag as the great symbol of its success is because actually for a lot of gay men and women, it has been a real success. And they are maybe quite rare, actually. So I'd say, so the type of person who has probably been least disappointed by this political movement would be, say, let's say a lesbian woman who is quite masculine in her personality and who doesn't want to have children and who wants to work in and wants to excel in whatever profession she's chosen and stuff. I think that woman has probably done really well out of this, right? So This is why I'm saying this isn't like consistently a bad story, right? There are some people who've definitely benefited from greater freedoms that we've seen. Who's someone who has done badly from this? The woman who actually would like to be a stay-at-home mother, but finds it more difficult to do so because one of the effects of women entering the workforce is that it has become harder to support a family on a single income, would be one example. There are quite a lot of those, right? Or the woman who ends up in the sex industry because she was misled about what it's really like by sex positive feminism and ends up really messing up her life. I mean, I could go on, but it's a mixed bag.
Okay. So, I mean, one thing we hear a lot, and it's fairly obvious, is that arguably the chief beneficiary of the sexual revolution is the high status male, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that guy, if you're over 6 feet, whatever the boxes that need to be checked, there's a very small slice. And I don't know how you would quantify it percentage wise on like any given dating app. Is it like the top 5% of men? Is it slightly more? Is it less? Get 90% of the women. Can you kind of like just kind of tease out that algorithmic landscape?
Well, the famous kind of red pill data is it's 80% of women choose 20% of men.
That's better than what I just said, but okay.
I'm sure that it gets more extreme at the tails because the Pareto distribution is pretty wild. Yeah, so I think that those men, it depends on how you look at it, right? I think that those men have definitely done well in terms of like access to sex, right, with a variety of women. There's no doubt that those men are having a ball, right, according to that criteria. Would it be better for those men longer term to actually settle down and have children younger and commit to one woman? Maybe in a kind of spiritual sense, it might be better for them. But clearly a lot of them are voting with their feet or some other body part and choosing to enjoy the fruits of the sexual revolution. And a lot of women are left feeling disappointed by this. Do you remember West Elm Caleb?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Refresh our memories.
So that's
a blast from the past.
Yeah, this was like a few years ago. And it was this, kind of funny social media event where a bunch of women who were on dating apps discovered that they were all dating the same guy who was called Caleb and who worked at West Elm.
West Elm is the furniture store, kind of high end,
right?
But the kind
I
of
hadn't
stuff.
Heard of it.
Oh, you don't have it in the UK. This is the kind of stuff
so.
that you would, your first apartment as an adult in the big city with your first real job. Once you got a little bit of money, you could afford to get a few pieces from West Elm. It's not the highest, but it's a couple steps above IKEA.
He was working in some kind of office role there, like marketing or something. And actually, it was incredibly good marketing for West Elm because, as I say, I'd never heard of it before.
Yeah, maybe this was a long game. Okay.
Yeah, I did wonder this. they turned out they'd all been dating the same guy. And the thing is, I don't think that West Elm Caleb had done anything especially immoral according to contemporary standards, because I don't think he lied to any of these women and said that he was being exclusive with them. He wasn't married to any of them. He was basically just playing the field, which you are allowed to do according to, post-sexual revolution norms. But these women were unhappy about it because this guy was clearly a catch, and they were disappointed to discover that they weren't the only one. I think that this is quite a common female experience, and one of the reasons why women, well, not specifically discovering on the internet that your boyfriend actually has multiple other girlfriends. I mean, the feeling of wanting to secure commitment from men who withhold it is a big part of why women find the current dating landscape so frustrating.
And the reason this was a phenomenon is because they all got together and piled on him on social media. How did this become an event?
Oh, you're testing my memory now. I think that it ended up being a Facebook group or something like that.
Okay, of course.
No, not Facebook, because they're all too young to use Facebook. But I don't know. It was some kind of social media thing.
Right. So, I'm fascinated by this whole trad conversation, the way that a lot of younger people, especially on the right, but not exclusively on the right, have really romanticized periods in the past that they clearly know nothing about, and have just sort of they have layered some set of fictions and fantasies onto historic time periods where, there were a lot of problems. It was, I would not want to go back and live on the Great Plains, for instance. It was not so great. The Great Plains weren't so great, as it turned out, during the Homestead Act. But I understand where these fantasies are coming from. And you've been going around on campuses and talking to a lot of young people these past couple of years. Do they talk about wanting to go back to a simpler time, or wishing that they lived in the 1950s and things like that?
So, yeah, it's interesting that what you say about the Great Plains, because my strong impression of trad life culture online is that what's actually being romanticized is not trad life as such, it's frontier life.
Okay.
So it's a kind of uniquely American historical ideal. And of course, as I'm sure you know, women went so insane.
Yeah, there was literally
Prairie Madness.
Yes, Prairie
was
Madness.
The term. Yeah,
yes,
right.
There was a name for
a variant of hysteria. Yeah, because they were so lonely and terrified, and their lives were so grueling. Right. So,
and also the wind. The wind was so strong and howling. There was a cognitive. There was actually a physiological aspect to it. I think it's just, especially out there on the plains during that time. And I've lived in Nebraska, and I have personally experienced this. It would make them literally insane, and it did seem to affect the women more.
Yeah, right. So frontier life definitely is not quite what I don't know I don't want to say Ballerina Farm is kind of the standard.
Yeah.
Hannah Needleman is the standard example, but I don't want to dunk on her too much, because actually I think that yes, they're actually secretly rich or whatever, but I think that what she is aiming for in terms of returning to the land and just having loads of kids because she adores having kids and whatever, I think that there's a certain kind of stoicism and bravery which I find impressive in what she's doing. She could have lived a really easy life in Manhattan, and she's chosen not to, and I think in a way that's kind of cool. I mean, what she's striving for in her family life is obviously not what a lot of people don't get it at all, but I kind of get it. I know I know what she's doing in terms of choosing to do something hard well. Right. So I don't want to.
We should explain.
I don't want to bash her
for a moment who Ballerina Farm is. This is a very popular Instagram account, social media influencer. This is a large family. They live in Utah, I believe.
Mm. Yeah, they're Mormons. They are very attractive
young family. The woman, Hannah Needleman, is a former ballet dancer who, how many kids does she have now?
At least 7.
Okay, at least 7. And she's an incredible businesswoman. I mean, ultimately what she is a huge business success. So she's built this lifestyle brand around their homestead, their ranch, whatever it is, and everybody looks beautiful, and there's baking everything from scratch and ostensibly growing it, and playing around on tractors and this sort of thing. So I mean, I definitely get the idea. I'm with you there.
It's quite popular for people to say, oh, her husband is making her do this. Oh, she's being coercively controlled. I'm like, no, she's not. Men don't do this.
She's making him do it, probably.
Yeah, like it's always the women who are putting this stuff on Instagram, right? Like I don't buy that at all. But also, like there was a profile of them in the London Times, I think a little while ago, and it was revealed that she doesn't have a nanny, even though they have all these kids and they could totally afford a nanny because her husband is the heir to an airline fortune of some kind, so they have a lot of money, but she doesn't want one. And I get that, because that's not part of what she's striving to do. So I mean, part of what's going on here is, right, people are correctly identifying that there are problems with contemporary life that make people sad, and they're sort of casting around for a solution.
Right.
And the solutions are actually hard to come by. And so sometimes, people veer off into this kind of little house on the prairie lifestyle, which is actually somewhat fake, dysfunctional, whatever. But I can't help but sympathize. I mean, I think whether or not people are completely wrong in their ideas about the past, what they're reacting against is a sense that there are problems now that they want solutions to, and those solutions aren't apparent.
I mean, really, the premise of your book, or I should say, a big point that you make, and you give many anecdotes about over and over again, is just people cannot find mates because the balance is just so off. Like we just said, there's a huge number of women competing for a small number of men. It used to be that people would meet in person. There would be pressure to marry earlier. Before the birth control pill, if you wanted to have sex, you were pretty much going to have to commit to somebody and start your life. Absent of all of that, we just have everybody kind of competing for what they imagine is the best they can get. And sometimes they're unrealistic about what they can get. I don't really know what I'm asking exactly, but it does seem like there's a whole bunch of people that really have never had a relationship, are not able to find a mate, are effectively undateable. That's a very harsh way of putting it, because they just don't have the kind of avenues for meeting people and pairing up that used to exist. And a lot of those people, especially the men online, are kind of becoming pretty destructive, certainly to themselves.
Yeah, it turns out that marriage is a massive coordination challenge for society, right? Like, how do you get young people in the right place at the right time paired with the right other person? It's actually not that easy, and just getting rid of the frameworks that traditionally exist to try and encourage people in the right direction. Some people, it will work out great. I mean, I got married to my husband quite young, and just by pure luck, that kind of worked out for us. But it doesn't work out for a lot of people who drift or choose the wrong person, or it turns out it's actually quite hard. And I mean, the point that I make again and again in my work, hopefully in a careful, nuanced way, is that we shouldn't idealize the past or any other culture, because every trade-offs are eternal and every culture has its downsides. But when there are common threads throughout history, and in looking at the anthropological record as well, when all of these other cultures end up reaching some of the same conclusions and we don't, we are the one big exception, that probably suggests that we're wrong, right? So like, if every culture has, for instance, quite clear prescriptions on sex before marriage, particularly for women, if every culture has some kind of marital structure, whether it be polygamous, monogamous, etc., but they have something, they have a formal recognition of the reproductive relationship, doesn't that say something actually about the necessity of these things, right? I mean, I feel like that's a very mild claim to make, that if we're the one big outlier in the anthropological record, that probably suggests that there's something amiss.
So when you say we, you're talking about Western democracies.
Post-sexual revolution.
Post-sexual revolution.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, this idea that a kind of utopian social contract can be socially engineered into a culture. I mean, a lot of people hold that really dear, and they have since the 1960s. How long do you think it's going to take for people to kind of peel away from that?
I think Gen Z are already doing that. I think that the experiment has been run, not just in relation to the sexual revolution, all sorts of things, the whole kind of progressive package. The experiment has been run. A big part of the reason that the experiment was run was not just ideological, it was material. And that's something I spent quite a lot of time arguing in the book, right? That actually, yes, second wave feminism was a radical movement, etc. But the thing that really changed relationships between men and women was the pill. And then also the washing machine and the internet and all these other material changes that we've seen to our lives. Like, technology is the real spur of history, and ideology kind of jogs along in its wake. But there's ideology there as well, right? And I think that there are the true believers of the boomer generation have been largely proved wrong just by events, because it took some time for the consequences of tearing down the old guardrails to become evident. And I think this is why we're seeing Gen Z very much reacting against that politics. I mean, Gen Z is very polarized, so the story isn't that clear. But certainly young men are so much further to the right than their fathers, for instance. And I don't think that that's... I think that the reason for that is because it's evident to them that the downsides of the 60s have harmed them. And as we were talking about, they're casting around for some other kind of solution. Whether or not that solution is actually better, I don't know.
I want to do a little thought experiment here, the two of us. Like, let's pretend it's 1973. We're going to go back. We're going to meet some young people. Everybody's kind of reconfiguring their lives. It's the free to be you and me era, the second wave feminism. Everybody's, having free love and free sex, and women can be plumbers, and boys can have dolls, and those are good things. And people really think this is a new frontier. They're on the cusp of a revolution that is going to permanently change the course of kind of just human social organization for the better. What would you say to them if you were a person from the future, like coming down and said, "Hi, I'm Louise and I'm from the future, and I need you to know this"?
So I'd say that the really tangible ill effects of the sexual revolution, which are coming around the corner and which haven't really hit in, say, the 70s. I mean, so what the baby boomers experience basically is this one-time blessing where they got to grow up in the society forged by the kind of traditional restrictions, which, yes, did cause people pain and frustration, but did also lead to generally a much stronger society, right? So baby boomers got to grow up in that society that was relatively high trust. Their parents were likely to get married and stay married, etc., right? And then they also got to experience the great joy of rebelling against that as young adults and forging their own path and feeling really righteous and excited, And for a lot of them, that was fun, right? And that was on an individual level a good thing for them. The problem is the way that scales at the societal level, and the society that has been left for their children. This is really a one-time bonanza, right? The opportunity to rebel against that kind of society can only be done once. And now what younger people are dealing with is not just this challenge of coordinating matchmaking, which we spoke about already. It's also things like, in London, there are parts of America, I'm sure, where the same is exactly true. Only 50% of children reach the age of 15 still living with their biological father. Mm-hmm. And there is just so much evidence of the psychological harm that fatherlessness and divorce does to children. It is actually worse for a child to have their parents get divorced than to lose a parent to death. In terms
Really?
of the ongoing, in terms of the ongoing psychological harm done to the child, which is, of course, not to say that there are not cases where divorce is absolutely the right choice in cases of abuse. This isn't just throat clearing. This is true. There are clearly cases where it is the right thing. It is the lesser of evils. And feminists were completely right in the era to point out that legally binding women to men who beat them, for instance, is clearly a bad thing for women. I completely accept that. The problem is that we now have such high rates of divorce that it is now increasingly the norm for children not to grow up in that kind of stable two-parent home. Rob Henderson has written so beautifully on this. I don't know if you've read his memoir.
Yeah,
Troubles.
of course. Yes. And he's been on the podcast. But I want to just stop for a second here, because it would seem to me that this would be a correlation versus causation paradigm here. Because, okay, if your parents divorced, that is more likely to correlate with other factors, poverty, lack of education, just household chaos generally. If a parent dies, that's potentially a more random occurrence. So there could be a stable family. There could be, stronger relations with extended family, that kind of thing. So, okay. But I also wonder, the divorce rate is going down, is it not? Or is that just because people aren't getting married in the first place?
It's because people aren't getting married in the first place. Yeah, so I do concede that it's quite hard to tease this apart. There's also this genetic confounding issue. Like, is it, and there have been studies done comparing, say, children whose fathers go away to war versus children whose fathers are absent because they've left the family for the same period of time, and the children whose fathers left the family do worse than the children whose fathers are away at war. So clearly, like, maybe that's because fathers who leave the family are different in some way, right, than fathers who don't. This is all very complicated. Rob has written very well on this, so anyone who's like really interested in the data should go and read his work and read his book. However, I am convinced by the data that this is genuinely bad for children to go through divorce. And I think that there is a culture you read constantly in places like The Atlantic, the New York Times, these stories about women who left their families and tore their children's lives apart because they just weren't feeling it anymore. They didn't fancy their husbands anymore, etc. Men, of course, do this as well. I think the reason that we read women writing these accounts is just because if a man wrote that account in The Atlantic, everyone would think he was such an asshole. It would
never get published. His book would never be published, let alone win a prize.
Exactly. Yeah. So we shouldn't take this as evidence that women are more selfish than men or more likely to leave their families or whatever. Although women do initiate more divorces, famously. I always was quite skeptical of that data, that I think it's like women initiate 70% of divorces or something like that. Because I always thought, yeah, but women do the paperwork, right? Like, women are just more conscientious. And so maybe they're the ones who actually do the physical process of filing for divorce. But I changed my mind about that because I saw the data on lesbian divorces versus gay men getting divorced. And lesbians do get divorced a lot more than gay men do.
Oh, I wonder if that's because they get married too quickly.
Maybe
it's the U-Haul lesbian phenomenon, right? So
maybe
they set up house right away and then have to break it down. Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is something that the baby boomers really spearheaded or brought on, and they are the chief beneficiaries of this. And then you've got everybody beneath them, the Gen Xers and the millennials, and now Gen Z, bearing the brunt of this. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I've certainly observed this and sort of felt it on an intuitive level, but I haven't actually thought about it kind of spelled out as you just did until now. Like, they were really in the right place at the right time, those boomers.
Boomer bashing can get very heated.
Yeah. It's very basic too. It's beneath
and
both of us.
And very caricature. Yeah, so I don't want to lean into it too hard. I think, though, that there is definitely a grain of truth to the narrative. I also think that it can be quite easy for young people now to assume that the 50s was the historical norm when it wasn't the historical norm. It was actually a period of incredible, one, economic boom, but two, actually an unusual swing back towards more conservative family values, probably as a result of the Second World War, maybe some other factors as well. So the 50s were good in a bunch of ways, bad in a bunch of ways, they also weren't the norm. I mean, this
No,
kind of goes back
totally.
to what we were talking about with the false idealization of the past. But then equally, I don't want to. There's this annoying response that you sometimes get from progressives when young people, when say Brett Cooper fans express deep dissatisfaction with the status quo, and they say, "Yeah, but didn't you know bad things happened in the past?" It's like, when have bad things not happened?
Right.
I like, you can point to any era and point out its flaws, and this is one of the massive kind of rhetorical advantage that progressives have, right, over conservatives, because progressives don't have to look to the past, they just look to the future, but they look to an imagined future. And they say, if you do all the things that I want you to do, life is going to be so amazing. And of course, in this imagined future, it's impossible to nitpick and to identify flaws because it doesn't exist and it's never going to exist, right? Whereas if you're the conservative in the position of having to defend whatever it is, the 19th century, the 1950s, people can easily identify miserable individuals or, pernicious phenomena. And you could spend all day trying to defend an era that, can't be recreated even if you wanted it to, one thing.
So let's go back to this imaginary room of innocent, thriving 70s folks that we're talking to. So we're going to say, okay, you guys you can't imagine the damage you're going to do. You think you're happy now, but let me tell you, this is what's going to happen. How do you even start to talk to them? Do you say, okay, the kids that you have that are born in the 70s and the 80s, they're going to encounter what? Like, let's start right there. I mean, I know you're a millennial, so this is a little older or you're a young millennial. I think this is a little older than your cohort. But I mean, where does this start to fall apart in your mind? Because I think a lot of people around my age would say, well, the 80s was a pretty good time to grow up. And in fact, the 80s, there was so much 1950s nostalgia. It was like all over the place. I mean, Peggy Sue Got Married and Back to the Future. And, there was this just even the music, there was this kind of cult around like old 50s doo-wop music, and like the young kids thought it was cool. That was a pretty conservative time, and we were afraid of the moral majority and Jerry Falwell and all of that. But I guess you would argue that things were really starting to break down even at that time.
This stuff takes time, right? So these young people in the 70s who hold to completely different ideas than their grandparents, they're still forming quite a small minority of the culture. You've still the modal person, or the median age is still, a 30-something, a 40-something, right, who doesn't believe in any of that stuff. And then you've got a large proportion of older people who really don't believe in any of that stuff. And actually it takes quite a long time for the last people who really hold to those traditional ideas to die. So now, the people who, so my grandmother is 89 and she can just about tell me about meeting my grandfather at a local dance, and she had her children in her early 20s, and they basically lived a very conservative life. And a very upwardly mobile one as well, because that was, my family are Australian, but it's a very similar story to America, where you had this incredible period of boom. But soon there won't really be people around who can talk about that, and who have an instinctive commitment to older moral ideas before the sexual revolution happened, or the progressive revolution happened. So in the 80s, you're still kind of huffing on the fumes of that culture. Do you know what I mean? Because most people actually still were basically formed by that culture.
Yes.
And then it's only really when you get to the turn of the millennium that the ballast provided by that majority collapses. And I think that's why it feels initially like you can tear down Chesterton's fence and it's fine, right? Because actually the ill effects of tearing down Chesterton's fence can take some time to realize themselves. Sometimes it can be quite quick. So like the divorce rate, for instance, shoots up pretty quickly in the 70s.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
As soon as it becomes not just legally, but also socially acceptable for people to do this. But then, of course, this tidal wave of children raised in divorced households, that doesn't come in You don't see that. Those children don't become teenagers and adults for some while later. So there's always a lag.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons why it's quite easy for progressives to pat themselves on the back prematurely.
Yeah, so the divorce generation was definitely my generation, the latchkey kid, that whole thing. And one of my pet theories is that the reason that Gen X parents are so overprotective, helicopter parents, just overly involved in their children's lives is because they're rebelling against the benign neglect, hopefully benign, of their own upbringing. The 70s, especially in more urban areas, among the sort of elite bourgeoisie, it was very, very, very permissive parenting culture like you've never seen. And so I think there's a real backlash to that. But I see what you're saying. So essentially the damaged products of this experiment are now running the asylum. There's really very few people left over who can kind of be the proverbial church lady, right? There's not like Sarah and I, when I was doing the podcast with Sarah Hayter, we'd often talk about the different experiences we had in school. Like when I was in high school or even elementary school, there were like pretty stern old lady teachers, making you diagram sentences and learning grammar. And more importantly, just being old and strict and mean. They were literally from the 50s. Like it hadn't been that long ago. They were like old fashioned and they were still around. They were in our lives. And that person is no longer active in the workplace and in the social world. Like that person would be your grandmother's age, if not older by now. So yeah, I see what's happening. Okay. So Gen Z sees all this and they're effectively saying, okay, like hit the brakes. We're not doing this anymore. We're going to radically reshape things. Do you think they have a plan? I sometimes think this is what the JD Vances of the world want to have happen, but he doesn't really have the ability to do the things necessary to even start to think about it happening in a productive way. Where do we go from here?
So, one of the things that is very striking about Gen Z is how much gender polarization there is. And this isn't just true in the States, this is true all over the place. I think the most extreme version of this I've encountered is in South Korea. Germany also has massive gender polarization. And I find this so fascinating as a question, right? Why exactly is this happening? Some people say it's because women are just innately left-wing and men are innately right-wing, and you see this divergence because people are just flocking to their political homes, right? I don't think that's true, not least because you can find copious examples of women in the past being right-wing, right, or being the key defenders of the status quo and of conservative values, not least the church ladies that you mentioned, but there are loads and loads of examples of this in other countries as well.
You talk about somebody named Mary Whitehall in particular. Mary Whitehouse, excuse me. Yes.
She's a very fascinating historical figure. So she was kind of like the British Phyllis Schlafly, a little bit older than Phyllis Schlafly, but she was, the conservative housewife campaigning against falling moral standards on TV and stuff. And she was very fearsome and very frightening too.
And very much mocked. Everybody made fun of her.
There was a porn star who changed her name to Mary Whitehouse and then who later committed suicide, really. Mary Whitehouse is a really interesting figure because she lost, right? She completely and utterly lost. She was very popular for a period and she really did have the Housewives of Britain on her side, as Phyllis Schlafly was for a period. But she obviously failed. And there were some things that history now judges her very harshly for. I think she was very clearly homophobic, for instance. Like she quite straightforwardly argued that if your son comes out as gay, you should disown him, etc. She was right about other things, though. She was pointing out, for instance, that the celebrity world was full of pedophiles in the 70s and 80s. And it was, right? And she pointed out that pornography has a pernicious effect on society. And it does, right? I argue that it does. And it particularly has a bad effect on young minds. So sometimes these reaction movies are right about things. But anyway, point being, there are plenty of examples of women being... The idea that women are just innately drawn to wokeness, I think is not really true. I suspect that what's going on is actually that marriage de-radicalizes people. It de-radicalizes both sexes. And there is actually some really interesting data on this. I wrote an essay on this recently for Substacks, which links to this data if anyone wants to read further. That it was on Valentine's Day, and it was called On Fraternizing with the Enemy. When the longer that men and women are married to each other, there's a longitudinal study I cite, the more similar their political views become. And partly that's because they're having the same kind of life experiences, right? They're living in the same place and they're having children, etc. But some of it is also that they just come to have more empathy, like actual empathy, not just sympathy, with the opposite sex, because they identify with the interests of their spouse. And that's exactly what young people are not doing. Because as we've discussed, there's this marriage crisis and people are delaying relationships and people are remaining single well into their 20s and beyond, and, you know, not just men, but also women. And I really think that part of what's going on with the gender war and with gender polarization is people just not really having meaningful relationships with the opposite sex.
Yeah.
Not getting to know the opposite sex properly, not identifying with their interests, but also not recognizing that, you know, I've expended a lot of effort on arguing that men and women are psychologically dissimilar in some quite important ways. Obviously, there's overlap, but the psychological differences between the sexes are real and important. But you know what? They're mostly, some of them are important and troubling, like sexual violence, proclivity, and things like that. But some of them are just kind of funny or silly or like adorable, and they're just like a lot of sex differences actually. When you are married to someone for a long time, you come to realize are basically fine.
Right.
Fine.
Well, it definitely demystifies them. It defangs them. Like if this is just a matter of like, he can't see where his socks are right in front of him on the floor. I mean, again, a cliche, not necessarily untrue for reasons I don't know.
It's completely true.
Have we ever figured out why that is exactly?
It's true of boys as well.
Yeah.
My eldest son, like he will be looking for something that's right there. I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, these kind of like greetings card level jokes about men and women, they're true and they're kind of funny and fine. But I think that that's what these often angry and lonely and too online young people don't learn. So They come to kind of catastrophize about the opposite sex.
Yes.
This is true for men and for women, right? I was very struck after Trump won the second time with the wave of young women on TikTok who were committing to the 4B movement. You know about this?
Yeah. Now, explain what that is. And was that actually a thing? Explain what the 4B movement is.
You're testing me on what the B's stand for. But basically, it's a South Korean feminist movement that encourages women to reject relationships with men, so sexual relationships and having children with them and whatever. Basically separatism. Okay. And South Korea has some of the most disastrous sex relations in the world. So that, you know, they're really not a model that we should be following. But after Trump won, the view from women on TikTok who committed themselves to the 4B movement was that Trump won because of men. Mm-hmm. When we know that married women majority voted Trump, but okay, right. That Trump won because of men, and therefore they should not associate with men.
This is the Lysistrata kind of
they
maneuver.
Should go on strike.
Yes, yes. So we should say the 4B movement refers to 4 no's. So I guess in the Korean language, these words all start with B, roughly meaning no. So the core tenets are no sex with men. I guess you can have sex with women. No sex with men, no giving birth, no dating men, no marriage with men. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Not a heavy lift for a lot of people, depending on their situation. So,
I mean, you know what? I did think from watching some of these 4B videos on TikTok that sometimes what was going on was actually that women were deeply dissatisfied with the dating market for the reasons we've discussed already, and this was kind of offering an off-ramp.
Yeah. Oh, it's
that was socially acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's like, it's not that I can't get a guy to call me back, it's that I'm joining the resistance.
Yeah,
right?
You didn't break up with me, I'm breaking up with you. Yeah,
exactly. So I think that's part of what's going on. I mean, all these months later, I don't know how many of these women have actually stuck to their guns. But
okay, so now I want to shift a little bit before we wrap up and sort of I know you have a lot of like initiatives on the ground and stuff that you're doing IRL. I understand that you are doing or have done a kind of speed dating thing or matchmaking for conservative-minded young people. Is that true? And is it working?
So I will say that I don't organize it. So I have 2 young children. I don't have time for this stuff. I don't organize them, but my podcast listeners organize these things. There have been 2 in London, and there are plans to do more. I mean, basically, it's just like a fan get together, but the idea is that people who are single come along, and it's a good principle, right? Because you're filtering basically for people who have roughly the same view of this stuff, who want to get married, who think that having children is a good thing, that sort of thing. So it's not a bad idea, and it's clearly the case that dating apps are really dysfunctional, and in real life is better if you can make it work. I mean, the issue though is everyone else is on the apps. Right.
So, okay, but who comes to these? Can you get enough men to show up?
Yeah, if anything, there's a surfeit of men sometimes.
Really?
I mean, so when we did the first one, there was a slight excess of men. And so we had to like adjust the numbers to make it exactly 50-50. And we did a little bit of tinkering with the ages and stuff. Because the first one we did, I was involved, and we did a whole filtering process to make sure that it was as intended, right, as a matchmaking event. Subsequent ones, they've used a similar sort of principle. You have to apply.
Okay.
So you don't just rock up.
Okay. But I mean, are they like, how conservative are they? Are they people who are not having sex until marriage, or are they just like, what's the demographic?
So some people, yeah, but I would say that my modal reader and listener is either, I think there are 2 routes that people come to this. Either they're raised as a secular liberal and they become dissatisfied with that, which is me, that's my journey, or they come from a more conservative and religious background and decide that actually they're like, it's too misogynist, it's too hardcore, they want something more moderate. So they're kind of meeting in the center.
Okay.
That would be my typical listener and a typical person who goes to one of these events.
Okay. Has anybody like gotten together and in a serious relationship as far as you know?
So as far as I know, there are no like engagements. There were definitely second dates.
Good. Okay. Yeah, we in the Unspeakeasy, we've been toying with the idea of doing matchmaking, kind of, heterodox, the horrible word, whatever word we can come up as a substitute, thought criminal, dissident matchmaking. But it seems perilous. I don't want to be responsible for somebody having a terrible date. It does seem, the liability seems like a concern, you know?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, we have to start somewhere, don't we?
Exactly.
I also think in general, that we should probably all get used to being a little bit more interventionist with our friends and relations.
You mean
in terms of
fixing people up?
Yeah, being actively helpful in this regard, I think should become more normal.
Mm-hmm.
If you know someone who you think is a good match for someone, and also equally, if you're single and you really want to find someone, just like be really pathetic and ask your friends and family to help you.
I know, but the problem with that is then they do fix you up, and then it's like, what? This is what you think of me? You're fixing me up with this person, and then then they'll be like, you asked for it.
That's the thing; it's a perilous process.
Yeah,
I don't have an easy answer to this. I really wish I did. This is probably the question that I get most commonly from people is like, how do I find a spouse? And I say,
Okay. And again, by way of starting to wrap things up, let's go back to talking to these people in the 70s. We're going to say, all right, we're going to have the kids that grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and the millennials are going to come. The millennials seem to be doing pretty well, though, like on balance. They don't seem to be kind of peaked with this crisis mentality the way Gen Z is. If you were going to describe to the young baby boomers back in the 70s what was going to happen with the generation that is their kids, the millennials, how would you characterize that?
Are millennials okay? It depends on how you look at it.
I mean, they seem to be doing financially. Economically, they seem to be thriving again. But this is very, segmented.
Right. That's the thing. It's difficult to pass. I think I don't entirely buy the narrative that young people today are impoverished and boomers are all rich, right? That's clearly not true. There clearly has been some, this is very class dependent. So there's a lot of divergence within these age groups. However, I think that young people certainly feel as if they've been hard done by economically. And I do think that, I mean, Elizabeth Warren, of all people, wrote this superb book back in the day called The Two-Income Trap, which is about how the expectation that women will participate in the labour market, not women having the right to do so, but it becoming a norm, which is really from the 1990s on. It actually takes what I was talking about earlier, right, where it takes time actually for these processes to unfold. So women gain the right to access the professions a long time before they actually do en masse. And then it's in the 1990s that working mothers become a normal thing and kids being in daycare become a normal thing. And I can still find people who, I have a friend who grew up in rural Scotland in the 80s and they didn't have daycare anywhere near her. It just didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. So this seems like ancient history, but actually it's a relatively recent phenomenon. Elizabeth Warren argues that causes great financial vulnerability in families because it means that if one of you loses your job, it used to be that the mother was kind of there in the nuclear family, that the mother was there as the reserve pool of labour if the father lost his job, that she could go to work as an emergency backup if there was some disaster, like he got ill or something. When both of them are expected to work full time, that reserve pool of labour doesn't exist anymore. The other problem is that basically families bid each other up for desirable family homes, and they're bidding with two incomes, not with one. So if you're a single income household, you're at a disadvantage when you're bidding for the most expensive thing you'll ever buy, which is a house in a good school district, right?
Interesting.
So Elizabeth Warren, of all people, is pointing out that actually it becoming the norm for women to work, and for mothers to work in particular, causes negative effects for everybody, which are quite difficult to avoid.
Wouldn't it be great if people like Elizabeth Warren were willing to participate in this kind of conversation? Like she could talk about her economic principles, but synthesize them with a lot of the social realities that people on podcasts talk about, but people like Elizabeth Warren would never touch with the 10-foot pole. And it's so frustrating because all of these people I know who worship Elizabeth Warren, I start to talk about this stuff and they think that they're completely put off by it. And it would just really take the sting out if a lot of these people would recognize the way that their ideas overlap with some of this stuff that feels so taboo to them. It's really all of a piece. So, okay. So the millennials are doing sort of okay, depending on who they are, where they are.
Millennials are not as nuts as Gen Z. I mean, Abigail Schreier's book on bad therapy is so good on this point, right? The level of anxiety and depression and contagious mental illnesses like rapid onset gender dysphoria and TikTok Tourette's and all this crazy stuff that young people are experiencing, that seems to be confined particularly to the young people who grow up on the internet, but also young people who often didn't have the stable homes and spent a lot of time as young babies in daycare and did all these things where, I don't want to catastrophize about any of this, but it's not good for children, okay? And there's probably a cumulative effect. And at the margins, children are not faring as well psychologically as they would otherwise because of all these modern phenomena. And millennials are, less affected by this. But these are long stories that we're talking about. These gradual breakdowns of guardrails that used to exist. And I think if I'm arguing against anything, it's the reckless optimism of people who think that you can just design a new society on the back of an envelope and it will be okay. I think that history suggests that is almost never true.
Okay, well, you can tell that to the people currently working in the U.S. government, but okay. All right, so we're going to say to the boomers, guess what? Your grandchildren are going to come along and they're going to see things really differently. They're going to be really frustrated. They're going to want a new landscape here. How are they going about it? What do you see young people doing? I mean, beyond the like Little House on the Prairie fantasies and all of this, like what kind of meaningful change is actually being enacted or could be enacted?
What is being enacted? Not much, as far as I can tell. I mean, mostly it seems to be people just aren't forming relationships and they're hating the opposite sex, and they're spending a lot of time online. I don't want to be too harsh on young people.
But there's this whole pronatalism movement. I mean, there are people who are talking about the importance of having children, and we don't have time now to get into the economics of that. People will argue that we do not have a population crisis. Others will say we do. It's very complicated. But people are starting to talk about these things. I mean, the fact that you have so many young people following your work, you have written this book, clearly there's an audience for it. What do you imagine when you look 30 years down the road? Like when your kids are young adults, what seems like a feasible environment?
I think it's really unlikely that the vibe shift reverses, at least fully. I think that the idealism of the 60s is dead. And actually, I think that when the generation who were true believers have gone, I just don't think anyone left will still believe in that stuff. That includes, by the way, I'm not just thinking of the idealism of the sexual revolution, but say the idealism of, liberal ideals around bipartisanship. I mean, we're seeing both sides. This isn't just true in America, this is true everywhere. We're seeing all of that basically trashed and seeing a much more pugnacious and crude kind of politics emerging, which is regrettable but maybe inevitable. Because of course the other story here is there is just, given the birth rate problem, which you've just discussed, we are going to see more and more economic strain. We're not going to see the kind of economic optimism that people enjoyed in the 1950s, right? Because it's just the dependency ratio is too bad for that to be possible. So
what do you mean by dependency ratio?
The proportion of the number of workers per elderly dependent, the ability of the welfare state to support the sick and the old and the infirm, is just going to become more and more degraded over time because there isn't really any other way that can happen. I strongly suspect that politics is just going to move to the right over the next couple of generations. And maybe also simultaneously, I mean, I don't know. I know that people are always, the one thing that we didn't really talk about today, but which is obviously part of this story, is de-Christianization. And there are people like Tom Holland, for instance, who compare the 1960s to a kind of second Reformation, where if the first Reformation was about rejecting Catholicism, the second Reformation is about rejecting Christianity, full stop. That's obviously a big part of what's also causing psychological destabilization and leading to all of these rapid social changes. Maybe what we see more of, I don't know. There are people who say we're going to see Christian revival any day now, but we could also see more of a move towards a kind of post-Christian right, which Trump really exemplifies, actually. I don't know. What I do think is very unlikely, though, is that the children of the 60s are going to be vindicated, at some point in the future. I think that's really
okay, but this is, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is this like all gloom and doom? Is there a path for, J.D. Vance at his best? I don't mean to keep harping on him, but I do think he has some interesting ideas. And I really do like the way he was talking about the birth rate and family policies and how to how to empower families and family life. For a while, he was really good on that. He seems to be caught up with other things at the moment. But is there any kind of hope on the horizon, I guess? I mean, I don't have kids, but people who have kids, I like to ask them, how are you not just totally depressed and worried for them? I mean, you have to just intrinsically have hope for the future.
It's only gloom and doom if you're a progressive. I didn't say gloom and doom. I just said the future's more right wing. Right? Like, what you think about that is up to you, right? So on the birth rate question, I am not, in the long run, we're fine. In the long run, people who want to have children are going to have children. They're going to make it work. People right now who, I mean, I spoke at a conference in Budapest recently on the birth rate question. And I think that the average TFR on the panel was like 8 kids or something. I mean, there are people who are having really big families against the odds. Or, you know, JD Vance has 3 children. Like, there are loads of people who are making it happening. Eventually, this will all work out. I think it will be a rocky road economically, but then, you know, maybe this has to happen. Maybe the welfare state was a bad idea, given that it's proven to be unsustainable. So I think that we're in for a hell of a ride. But I think that in the end, I don't think humanity is going to end. And I don't think that catastrophe awaits us. I just think that we're going through a transition.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of progressive assumptions are proving to be wrong.
Yep. I actually, I have to say, I agree. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I mean, more and more, it just seems obvious that the period between, let's say, 1968 and, I don't know, 2020, maybe even a little before that, was a blip. It was really a cultural and civilizational anomaly.
Yeah.
And to just see it as the default is really misguided. Well, Louise, this is great to talk with you as always. I know you have a podcast in addition to having the new book. Tell us where we can find you and anything else we need to know.
A podcast that you've very kindly been a guest on as well. So the podcast is called Maiden Mother Matriarch, and it's available on all podcast platforms, but I also host the extended version on Substack, where I also post some of my writing and kind of updates on what I'm doing. So yeah, anyone who wants to follow my work can subscribe there.
All right. Well, thank you. And congratulations on the book and all that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Meghan.
Thank you for joining me for this latest Unspeakable podcast interview. This podcast will soon be renamed The Unspeakeasy. It is not going to change in substance. We're just going to make a slow transition to a new name. Additionally, I have recently launched the Unspeakeasy Live, which is a twice-a-week live stream, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on Substack. I will be chatting with guests, friends. Sometimes I'll just be chatting into the camera, which is the phone. They make us use the phone. And you can interact. You can ask questions, leave comments. If you're a paying subscriber, you can get the video of the event the next day. So please join me over there. Once again, my new book, The Catastrophe Hour, Selected Essays That You Probably Have Never Read, is now out. You can buy it wherever books are sold, and I'll be having a book club as part of the live stream starting this summer. So I hope you will join me there. Thank you, as always, for your support, for your patience, for your enthusiasm. I will be back very soon with another super nuanced guest. See you then.